first half of Chapter 4, we looked at some of the ways in which researchers determine causes or potential causes of cancer. And so now in the second half of the chapter, I wanted to focus on, well, what are some of those known causes? And as I mentioned, a lot of this is really previewing what we're going to dig a little bit deeper into in some upcoming chapters. So number one on the list is definitely age. So age is your greatest risk factor for developing cancer. You can see in this data down here that pretty much no matter what type of cancer you're looking at, you see your probability of developing cancer increasing greatly with age, especially once you get above age 60, your risk jumps way up. Some have suggested this is just normal part of the aging process, sort of part of our body's self-destruct, time to go type mechanism. And you might ask, well, it doesn't really make much sense. If cancer is so detrimental, why wouldn't human evolution, have selected against this, right? If this is our own bodies killing us, why wouldn't we have evolved past that? And of course, the issue is that because cancer is developing well after the main reproductive years, it's really outside the realm of evolution at that point, right? Because evolution is really just focused on what is going to either help you or prevent you from passing your genes on. And, by the time you're 60, most people are not passing their genes on anymore at that point. So evolution's not really too concerned about you in that regard. If you want to be really cynical about it, there are some that may suggest that there may actually be some evolutionary advantage to cancer in terms of population control and resource allocation. But for sure, that's a cynical way to look at it. Behind age, for sure, environment is also a big risk factor. We know there's lots of things in the environment that can cause cancer. We'll talk about a few of those. And some of that basic first evidence for this idea just came from the fact that cancer rates vary in different parts of the world. And I mean, in particular, different types of cancer are more prevalent in different parts of the world. So, for example, you see high incidence of stomach cancer in Japan, but not in the U.S., whereas in the U.S. you see a very high incidence of breast cancer, much lower in Japan, for example. And of course, some of that could be attributed to genetic differences between people in these different parts of the world, but really overall, the diversity in the human genome is pretty minimal. So we think a lot of these differences are environmental. And best guess calculations suggest that really only about 10 to 20% of your cancer risk is due to your genetics, whereas about 80 to 90% of our risk is actually coming from the environment and things that we encounter day to day. Just to dig a little deeper into this idea, some even stronger evidence for the importance of environment and its ability to cause cancer comes from studies looking at people that have changed their environment. Excuse me. So, for example, if you look at Japanese men in Japan, as I mentioned, there's a higher incidence of stomach cancer there, and there's a pretty low incidence of colon cancer in men in Japan. Whereas if you look at white men in the U.S., in California specifically, we generally see a pretty low rate of stomach cancer and a high rate of colon cancer. So what happens if we look at Japanese men that have immigrated to California? Well, we see the stomach cancer rates drop in those men and the colon cancer rates increase. And then if we look at those men's sons who are still living in California, we see more of a change towards the native Caucasian cancer rates. So that's pretty strongly arguing that it's not genetic differences between these Japanese and white males. It's something environmental, some environmental change between Japan and California. Now, what that specific change is, may be hard to determine or may be unknown. So if we think kind of big picture, well, what are some of these different environmental factors known to cause cancer? Well, at the top of the list, of course, is tobacco, right? Just cutting tobacco out of your life is going to reduce your cancer risk dramatically, and we'll talk some more about that. We've got a big slice of risk here attributed to diet, right? We can think of that as environmental exposure, um, infectious agents, primarily viruses. We're going to talk more about that in some coming chapters. Um, Hormones and exposure to environmental hormones can play a rate, uh, play play a role. Sorry. Ionizing radiation, various occupational exposures, typically to chemicals in most instances, alcohol, UV radiation, pollution, other drugs. Um, and then this is a little bit alarming. We've got almost 10% here that's just unknown. But anyway, hopefully you get the idea that there's quite a bit of variation here in terms of what we're exposed to in our environment. Lots of things that may be contributing to development of cancer. So let's talk about tobacco here and smoking for a minute. So as I think I mentioned in a previous chapter, lung cancer was an extremely rare disease up until about the 1920s. And then we saw this huge increase in smoking, which was then followed up by this huge increase in lung cancer cases. So you can see cigarette consumption here is the purple line. And then you see male lung cancer deaths in the green line here, female lung cancer deaths in the red line. And again, this is really very typical of like exposure to chemical carcinogens, which is what you're doing when you smoke cigarettes, is this lag between the initial exposure and the development of cancer. And in many cases for smoking, there's going to be a 25, 30, 35-year gap, right, between when you start smoking and when you potentially develop lung cancer. So what's going on here? Why do we see so many fewer female lung cancer deaths? Well, really that's just attributed to the fact that initially when cigarettes were first introduced, it was socially unacceptable for women to smoke. So they just simply started smoking en masse later than men did. So we did see those lung cancer rates catch up to those of men. It was just a little bit of a lag because they didn't start smoking quite as early as men did. And I also mentioned in previous chapter that, earlier in this chapter, that you see a pretty direct correlation between your dosage of tobacco smoke and the carcinogens therein and your risk of lung cancer. So you can measure this a few different ways, right? You could look at, well, how many cigarettes per day is a person smoking? You see a direct increase correlation there. At what age did they start smoking? If you started smoking earlier, that's going to increase your cancer risk. And then you could even look at how deep you inhale the cigarette smoke. So I've never been a smoker, so I hadn't really thought about this, but I guess some people are deeper inhalers and some are lighter. And the deeper you inhale, I guess the bigger dose of those carcinogens you're intaking, and hence increased risk. So, if you combine lung cancer with all the other tobacco-related illnesses like heart disease and stroke, we estimate, getting close to about 500,000 of the 2 million deaths every year in the U.S. being attributed to smoking, which is pretty staggering. And as you're probably aware, right, even just exposure to secondhand smoke can increase your risk of lung cancer. It's been estimated up to about 30%. And in fact, there have even been some studies uh, implicating what they call third-hand smoke and increased cancer risk. So that would be you would be exposed to third-hand smoke if you were exposed to someone that was exposed to a smoker, right? So let's say your roommate went out to a bar, they didn't smoke, but they were exposed to secondhand smoke in the bar. They come home, you're exposed to your roommate. That would be considered third-hand smoke. And we think secondhand smoking causes or exposure to secondhand smoke causes over 7,000 lung cancer deaths. every year in the United States. And here we have just a portion of the long list of carcinogens that are found in tobacco smoke. So it's a pretty alarmingly long list. There's been a lot of interest too in trying to study the effects of alcohol and tobacco together on cancer rates. And interestingly, there seems to be a synergy between those two in terms of ability to cause cancer. So, of course, if you look at non-smokers or non-drinkers, they have relatively low cancer rates. And here we're looking specifically at oropharyngeal, mouth, throat, and neck cancers. If you look at just heavy drinkers but non-smokers, you see about a six-fold increase in cancer rates. And then if you look at heavy smokers that don't drink, about a sevenfold, so pretty similar increase in cancer risk there. But if you look at people that are heavy drinkers and heavy smokers, this is where you get the synergy. You have about a 38-fold increased risk. So it jumps up very dramatically. So what's going on here? Well, what researchers think is happening is if you're a heavy drinker, and I'm not sure exactly how they're defining heavy drinking in this particular study, but presumably multiple drinks of hard alcohol every day, that repeated exposure to alcohol is killing cells in your mouth and in your throat. And of course, the cell death is then kicking on cell proliferation to try to repair that damage. And you combine that with the exposure to all those carcinogens in the list I just showed you in the tobacco smoke. Now you're mutating the DNA in those proliferating cells, and that combination is not a good one, right? So mutagen plus cell division seems to be particularly good at causing cancer. So I guess the bottom line there is, ideally don't do either. But if you are gonna smoke or drink heavily, pick your poison, do one or the other, but not both. And we saw in that pie chart that diet was a pretty large contributor to cancer risk. And we have an upcoming chapter talking about diet and cancer. But the bottom line is really that because our diets are very varied and complex, it is exceedingly difficult to pinpoint individual factors or chemicals in our diet that really elevate cancer risk. And so we don't really like to think of it this way, but our food really is just a mixture of different chemicals, right? And of course, some of those chemicals are going to be carcinogenic. Most of the attention in terms of cancer causing ability has been focused on additives, so preservatives or pesticides or things like that may be in our food. But of course, those are really a very small percentage of what we consume. And I did just want to point out that, plants, healthy foods that have arguably been shown in many, many studies to reduce cancer risk do produce natural pesticides and do produce some of their own carcinogens naturally. So, some of these are fairly benign, but you do have things like aflatoxin that's produced by a fungus and can contaminate natural foods like nuts typically. That can be a big problem. So I don't want this list to scare you. You say, oh, okay, well now I can't eat mushrooms or pineapples or apples. But of course, as I said, you know, study after study have shown that eating diet increased in fruits and vegetables is going to decrease your risk of cancer. So, despite the presence of some of these carcinogens in these natural foods, most fruits and vegetables also contain a long list of anti-carcinogens, and we'll talk about some of those in a later chapter that are going to reduce your risk of cancer substantially. So since I had mentioned aflatoxin, I just wanted to talk about that a little bit more here. So you can see if you look at the data from the Ames test, right, which is measuring the ability to mutate DNA. Aflatoxin is way up at the top of this list in terms of its mutagenic potential and cancer-causing ability. And in fact, as I mentioned, this is produced by mold Aspergillus, which can contaminate grains or nuts. And they've done some animal studies, and in this one particular study, they gave this would be what 1/10,000th of a gram of aflatoxin to rats, spread out over a 16-month period, and that tiny amount gave every single rat in that study liver cancer. So it is very, very potent mutagen, as I mentioned. Um, and aflatoxin is thought to contribute to some of the very high rates of liver cancer that you see in parts of Africa and Asia. You see much higher liver cancer rates there than in much of the Western world. So not really an issue for the most part in the U.S. We're pretty diligent about treating with fungicides to try to keep Aspergillus under control. Another dietary factor to consider would be red meat consumption. So there has been a lot of data showing a link between red meat consumption and colon cancer rates. And if we think of this just environmentally, you see this pretty linear correlation between the amount of red meat consumed per country and colon cancer rates specifically. So you can see the U.S. way up here. Well, it seems like only New Zealand is consuming more red meat than we do per day. But again, U.S. and New Zealand having the highest colon cancer rates. So it's possible there's some confounding variables at play here. You know, maybe if people are eating more red meat, they're consuming less fruits and vegetables in their diets. And I'd already mentioned, you know, some of the anti-carcinogens and the benefits in terms of cancer prevention of eating more fruits and vegetables. But there's such a large body of data here, it seems like there probably really is some direct link between red meat and cancer. And I think the physiology of this is still not quite clear. But one idea is that, you know, a higher fat diet, which of course you're consuming if you're eating more red meat, may trigger the liver to secrete more bile acids into the intestinal tract to try to deal with digesting the red meat. It's been shown some of these bile acids are carcinogenic, so it may be as simple as that. There's also a lot of data linking obesity and increased cancer risk. So, of course, a higher fat diet is going to tend to lead to higher rates of obesity, and that may be a contributing factor as well. This one's a little discouraging, but while we're on the topic of food, you know, it's possible even just your cooking technique could be increasing your cancer risk. So grilling, which of course Americans love to do, we like to grill everything, basically cooking over very high heat or over open flames is going to char the food, right? And that charred, burned food contains a couple of carcinogenic compounds, these polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and aromatic amines, which we'll talk more about in the next chapter, which is about chemicals that can cause cancer. But yeah, that charring that you get from these high heat cooking techniques does contain carcinogens, unfortunately. Another environmental factor linked to cancer was radiation. Radiation just simply defined as any energy traveling through space. But there's really two main types of radiation linked to cancer, UV radiation and skin cancer, and then ionizing higher energy radiation, things like X-rays or nuclear radiation. And you know, we'll talk more about skin cancer in an upcoming chapter. But of course, this is also tied in with your particular skin type and the amount of pigment that you have in your skin cells. And you know, in terms of, you think of like exposure to nuclear radiation or X-rays, right? Most of that is not going to be natural. It's usually going to come from medical research or occupational exposure. And, famously, Marie Curie, right, who discovered radioactivity and was carrying around like a chunk of radium in her lab coat pocket. She died of leukemia due to that high dose ionizing radiation exposure over a number of years. We'll get into radiation in chapter 6, dive a little deeper there. And then lastly, another big environmental risk or decent environmental risk for cancer was exposure to viruses. And we do have a whole chapter coming up on this as well, chapter 7. But I just wanted to mention that we've known about this link between viruses and cancer since 1911, when this famous research and Nobel Prize winner Peyton Rouse discovered what is now called the Rouse sarcoma virus, which was a chicken virus that could cause this sort of rare sarcoma, cancer of connective tissue in chickens. And he was doing some interesting experiments where he would remove the tumor from the chicken, grind it up, filter it through a very, very small, fine filter that would basically remove all the cells. So he had what you would call a cell-free extract, basically just the fluid from that chicken tumor, inject that into a healthy chicken wing, and lo and behold, you'd get basically the same tumor developing at the site of the injection, despite the fact that injected fluid contained no cancer cells. And it was determined that, well, there was a virus in that fluid, and that was causing the chicken cells to become cancerous. So there's a decently long list of viruses that have been found to be capable of causing cancer, including Epstein-Barr virus, which is linked to types of lymphoma, human papillomavirus, famously linked to cervical cancer, hepatitis B and C, liver cancer. But as I mentioned, we'll get into this in some more detail in chapter 7.